They built her a room underground, a small chamber, just off the calling gate, with a bed, a lamp already lit, and a little bread and water. Enough supplies to make the thing technically survivable, so that no one could say Rome had killed her directly. That distinction mattered to them. It would not matter to her. A ladder led down into the earth. She was carried there on a covered litter, bound so tightly that, according to the man who watched it happen, not even her cries could be heard clearly through the wrappings. At the bottom of the ladder, the priests set her down. They climbed back out. And then, in front of a silent crowd that had gathered because attendance was effectively mandatory, laborers filled in the pit and leveled the ground until you could no longer tell where the entrance had been. She was the highest-ranking priestess in Rome. The emperor who ordered this was, by his own account, restoring the sacred law of the city. The question is what he was actually protecting, and it isn't what he told anyone. The year is 91 AD. Rome is ruled by Domitian, the younger son of Vespasian, the last of the Flavian emperors, a man who has spent over a decade consolidating personal power at a rate that makes the Senate deeply, quietly nervous. He is taken to being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He has purged rivals, real and imagined, with increasing frequency. By the end of his reign, the historian Suetonius will describe a court so paranoid that Domitian lines the walls of his palace corridors with reflective stone, so he can see who is walking behind him. At the center of this story is Cornelia, the Vestalis Maxima, the chief Vestal virgin, the most senior of the 6 women who tend Rome's sacred hearth fire in the Forum. The Vestals are not ordinary priestesses. They are selected as girls, serve for 30 years under a vow of chastity, and in return hold a status no other woman in Rome possesses. They can own property, testify in court, move through the city without a male guardian, and their word is treated as close to inviolable. The fire they guard is bound up, symbolically, with the survival of the state itself. If a Vestal breaks her vow, Roman religious law says the fire itself is polluted, and an unchaste Vestal is not merely disgraced. She is incesta, ritually unclean, and the traditional punishment, unused for generations, is live burial. This is a story worth telling because it sits exactly where Roman power liked to hide its ugliest moves, inside religious law, where cruelty could be relabeled as piety. And it's a story Rome tried to soften almost immediately after it happened, because the man giving the orders had a motive that had nothing to do with chastity. Cornelia had held the office of Vestalis Maxima for years by 83 AD, when Domitian first accused her of incestum, the technical charge of unchastity. That first trial ended in acquittal. This detail matters more than it might seem to. It tells you Domitian had already tried once to remove her, and failed, which means that when he came for her again 8 years later, he was not a man discovering a crime. He was a man closing unfinished business. The second accusation came in 91 AD, and this time Domitian did not leave it to the ordinary court. Roman law technically assigned judgment in these cases to the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state religion, an office Domitian himself held, as every emperor since Augustus had. He used that authority to bypass the older customary procedure, which required a full hearing before the College of Pontiffs with the Vestal present to answer for herself. Instead, according to Pliny the Younger, who was alive and practicing law in Rome at the time, Domitian tried Cornelia in absentia, at his villa outside the city, and did it through what Pliny calls the jus pontificium, pontifical right, a technical loophole that let him control the entire process personally. Pliny is our best witness here, and it's worth naming exactly why. He wrote about the case in a letter to a friend, Cornelius Minicianus, years after the fact, once Domitian was safely dead, and it was finally possible to say what people had actually thought at the time. Pliny had watched the executions of Cornelia's alleged lovers. He is contemptuous of the process, and he says so plainly. He describes the whole affair as conducted with a cruelty dressed up as strictness. The men named alongside Cornelia were dealt with first, and this is where the story stops looking like religious enforcement and starts looking like a purge with a religious excuse. Several of the accused were prominent men. One, a former praetor named Valerius Licinianus, avoided execution by confessing and was permitted exile instead, later reportedly teaching rhetoric in Sicily on Domitian's own subsidy, which is a strange kindness for an emperor supposedly enforcing sacred law without mercy. Another of the accused, a Roman knight named Celer, refused to confess. He was beaten to death with rods in the Comitium, the public assembly space in the Forum, while Pliny tells us, still protesting his innocence with his last words. That detail survives specifically because Pliny wanted his correspondent to sit with it, a man executed at the direct order of the Pontifex Maximus, dying while denying the charge that killed him. Cornelia was condemned without ever being allowed to speak in her own defense in the manner tradition required. When the priest came to carry her to the underground chamber, Pliny records that she resisted, that at one point her clothing caught as she was being lowered, and the executioner, a public slave acting as officiant, offered to help free it, and she reportedly refused to let him touch her, even in that moment, on the grounds that she was still, technically, chaste and would not be touched by an unclean hand. Whether that detail is precisely accurate or a piece of moral shading added in retelling, it was the detail that stayed with Rome, the condemned woman still performing the ritual purity that was, at that exact moment, being used to kill her. Cassius Dio, writing decades later, with access to different sources, adds a detail Pliny does not include, that Domitian's real motivation traced back not to religion at all, but to a personal grudge and to political convenience. By 91 AD, Domitian was isolating himself from the Senate, executing perceived rivals on thin pretexts, and a public prosecution of the Vestals, framed as restoring ancestral religious discipline after decades of supposed laxity, let him appear as a guardian of tradition at the exact moment his actual behavior was making the aristocracy fear him more than any emperor since Nero. A high-profile religious purge, conducted personally with himself as both prosecutor and priest, consolidated exactly the kind of unchecked authority Domitian had spent his reign accumulating. What's genuinely disputed, and worth saying plainly, we do not have Cornelia's side of this at all. No source claims to know whether the original charge had any basis. The ancient authors who preserved this story, Pliny, Dio, and Suetonius more briefly, were all writing after Domitian's assassination in 96 AD, in a political climate that rewarded portraying him as a monster. That doesn't mean the burial didn't happen exactly as described. The core event is corroborated across multiple independent sources and was too public and too structurally documented, the location, the office, the procedural irregularity, to have been invented outright. But the motives attributed to Domitian and the sympathetic framing of Cornelia's final moments were shaped by writers with every reason to make a dead tyrant look worse than a living one ever could. Rome didn't erase this story the way regimes usually erase things, by destroying documents. It erased it by reclassifying it. While Domitian lived, this was official religious business, and criticizing it publicly was itself dangerous. Pliny says as much. He describes the atmosphere of the trial as one where lawyers and senators complied because refusal carried its own risk. The real suppression happened after Domitian's death, and it worked in the opposite direction from what you'd expect. The Senate didn't bury this story. They weaponized it, briefly, as evidence for Domitian's official condemnation, his damnatio memoriae, the formal erasure of his name from inscriptions and monuments across the empire. For a few years, Cornelia's death was politically useful precisely because it was scandalous. But usefulness faded fast. Once Domitian's successors, Nerva, then Trajan, had stabilized their own legitimacy, the case stopped being repeated in official contexts. There was no formal reversal of Cornelia's conviction, no rehabilitation, no monument. Pliny's letter survives only because his private correspondence happened to be preserved and published as literature, not as history. It circulated because Pliny was a celebrated stylist, not because anyone was trying to keep Cornelia's story alive. Suetonius mentions the episode in a single clipped sentence in his Life of Domitian, filed among a list of the emperor's cruelties, with no independent investigation. Cassius Dio's account survives only in later Byzantine epitomes, abridged centuries after he wrote it. What benefited from this quiet minimization was the office of Pontifex Maximus itself, and the principle behind it, that an emperor's religious authority over the Vestals was absolute and needed no external check. No later emperor renounced that power. They simply used it more carefully. Here's what the evidence supports. A woman was killed, using a punishment already centuries out of practical use, by a man who had tried and failed to convict her once before, acting simultaneously as accuser, prosecutor, and priest, with no meaningful defense permitted. Whether the original charge held any truth is unknowable and, honestly, beside the point. The mechanism is the story, a sacred law, dormant for a generation, reactivated at the exact moment it was politically convenient for the one man controlling it. What's uncertain is Cornelia herself. We don't have her voice. We only have how she looked to the men who wrote about her afterward, and every one of them had a use for that image. That's the part worth sitting with. Institutions rarely announce that they're being used as weapons. They just keep using the same old procedure, the same old law, the same old office, and trust that the ritual will make the outcome look inevitable.